question that we have in place here was directed towards this side of the stage. How do you support using stimulus money, putting new fronts on downtown stores in Big Rapids, when giving those same stores a tax cut on the awful MBT, Michigan Business Tax, would enable those same stores to cut prices to attract more customers and spend more money to use for their families?
So the question is to try to reduce the Michigan business tax
Versus spending stimulus money.
on storefronts particularly.
Well, I know nothing about storefronts in Big Rapids, but I do know that businesses compete on a lot of things besides price. And some of it is the attractiveness of the environment. I mean, you don't want to go into an old grungy looking store, do you? You only care about price, I take it. That's the only thing you care about. I care about other things too. I mean, my wife, there are a lot of cheap restaurants my wife won't go to because they're too dirty. You know, updating buildings is an important competitive strategy for businesses.
Well, I would disagree slightly with John in the sense that I don't think government should direct where the private sector should be spending their money on their own business, really. So, right. So tying the stimulus money only to the storefront and not allowing the business person to decide where it should be spent is not a very good idea. But I think reducing the Michigan business tax in the long run is also very important. In terms of cutting costs, for sure. I think we all agree that cutting taxes, no one really likes taxes. Cutting taxes in the long run, particularly business taxes, lowering their cost so that they can have a larger growth in the future is very good policy. The problem is that tax cuts are not a very good stabilization tool. They're not really very good for fine-tuning the economy at a time when there's the whole kind of economic downturn we have right now. So basically, cutting taxes are good for long-term growth, but not very good for trying to bring the economy out in the short run. In the short run, the government stimulus and the monetary stimulus are much more effective measures to bring the economy out.
Let me make a comment real quickly about that. In general, I think most economists agree that the market is better than the government at choosing what to invest in, choosing what to produce. You're going to get growth. I mean, look at 20th century history. It's the markets that basically work. And so that's why most economists don't think that fiscal policy should be used too often in terms of fighting the downturns and things like that. But this is why I wanted to come back a little bit to the idea that there are infrastructure investments like in education, highways and things like this that are productive. So when we talk about stimulus spending, you can find a million, well maybe not a million, but you can find a lot of things in there that most economists are going to look and say that's complete waste in terms of what this bill is. There were a lot of things thrown that economists are going to say that wasn't a good use of the money. But there were also a lot of things in there that were a good use of the money. So the question is, did it make sense for the government to do this at all? The reason I would argue it didn't make sense to do it now is because, in this sense, it's not that the government is competing against the private sector in terms of getting the money to do it, because right now the private sector isn't using it. So we have these unused resources, and if the government can put them to work effectively, and that's okay, and some people are going to believe the government can't do anything right. If you believe that, then disregard everything I say because it doesn't matter. But if you do think that the government can do some things right, now would be a good time for the government to actually say, okay, now we can do it because we're not hurting businesses, because businesses we're not taking resources away from businesses because they're not using them anyway right now. So now we can fix the highways, now we can build the schools and things like this that are going to be good for long-term growth.
I certainly can't defend that $1.5 trillion in stimulus spending or any of it for things like private storefronts. And one reason is, I think we've forgotten this in this country, we do have something called the Constitution. And I can't find anything in there that says that it's the duty of the federal government to throw money around for private storefronts. Now, if we're going to do that, then why don't we just finally stop pretending that we have a Constitution and tear it up and say, you guys can just do whatever you want, whatever you feel like. But more importantly, here's the dirty little secret of the two back-to-back stimulus spending programs. The big one, the 787, and then a subsequent budget thing, totaling about $1.5 trillion, passed in a matter of months, last year and early this year. If you look at, do you know what the total amount of personal income tax revenue is to the federal government this year? it's about $1.5 trillion. So the government could have achieved the same thing by just saying for one full year, nobody will have to pay a penny in personal income tax as a kind of stimulus. Okay? Now, why didn't they do that? I mean, after all, their stimulus package, they're months into it, they've only spent 10% of it. Why didn't they just say, if we're aiming for $1.5 trillion, we'll just let you keep $1.5 trillion? Can you imagine the stimulus we'd get if you didn't have to pay any?
Yeah.
The difference is, if it's left in your pocket, it doesn't empower politicians. You get to spend it, and they don't get to pass it out to their friends. That's the difference.
But if, suppose we decide to do that, well, okay, I guess we go a year without a military. You know, we go a year without a court system. We don't, you know, how do we protect the property rights if we don't?
Wait a minute. The total income tax revenue is only $1.5 trillion, okay? Which is the total that the government took in and spent for everything early in the Bush administration. So we're only talking about getting government back by a few years. And if they're going to spend a new $1.5 trillion to stimulate the economy, why wouldn't it be better to just let people keep $1.5 trillion?
Because they might not use it to stimulate the economy. They might use it to pay down their debt, which they might use it to buy more products.
Politicians who can't in months now spend more than 10% of it somehow are going to stimulate the economy more than you and I would when it's in our own pocket.
And the reason they didn't spend more than 10% is because they didn't want to waste it on storefronts. They wanted to say, okay, what projects are good, what investment projects are good. We can't, there aren't that many shovel-ready projects. This recession is going to last a period of time. These are good projects, we'll put them in place now, we'll put them in place that way. So there's sort of a decision they have to make. Do we do immediate short-term stimulus that may not be long-run productive, or do we invest in things that might have longer productivity that can't get built right immediately today? And so you're going to hit it no matter what they do.
Dan, at the core of what you're saying is basically this. People who actually sweat and earn and work and produce and take risks and build businesses, I'm not sure we can trust them with their money. If we take it from them and have politicians spend it, well, then we're more sure of stimulating the economy. And I'm sorry, I look at the way these guys behave in Washington, and I ain't buying it.
I'm also saying that we have 17% of our labor being underutilized or not utilized today, and more than 30% of our capital being underutilized. So we're trusting people to do it, and for whatever reason, the market isn't using it. The market's not using these resources. So we trust markets. I mean, some of my students in here, at least they were over from 365, and that's the whole lesson of fair economic systems, that markets work. You know, trust the market more than you trust the government, but right now the market's not allocating the resources. I mean, we're just letting that stuff sit there and not doing it. That's a waste.
Let me respond in a different way. Do you really think the private sector is going to invest in infrastructure when the rate of return is so low? Do you think the private sector is going to invest in education? I mean, I don't see a lot of free loans for students. Do you think the private sector is going to invest in R&D? What is the total investment in R&D? Basic R&D now, not product-related R&D. What's the total amount of basic R&D which the private sector is putting into the economy?
Every company of any size invests in R&D.
Product R&D, not basic R&D, not the kind which wins Nobel Prizes.
And now,
just one point I'd like to make on this issue about education, right? Have you ever heard anyone say, the government invests in education right now, K-12, in the state of Michigan. As Deputy State Treasurer here, I know we spend a lot of money on K-12 education, okay? Now, have you ever heard anyone say, gee, I want to move to the city of Detroit so I can send my kid to Detroit Public Schools? Have you ever heard anyone say that about Cleveland Public Schools, or Baltimore Public Schools, or Philadelphia Public Schools, or Atlanta Public Schools? I mean, come on, look. The private sector made this thing, right? I can do things on here I don't even know how to do, and yet you're going to tell me I can't teach a 4th grader to read? Something's wrong with the system. And the difference is, this thing's produced by the private sector, and K-12 education in our urban centers is produced by the government sector.
K-12 education everywhere is produced by the public sector. And a lot of places it works.
The reason why public sector education does not work in Detroit and works in East Grand Rapids and Forest Hills is because the parents are more committed to supporting their kids. So it's a question of inputs. The kind of inputs coming into the school are pretty bad in urban school districts, which are tough neighborhoods. So it's not the teachers themselves who are to blame, or the public sector per se, but the fact that the students are not getting enough support from their parents in terms of education.
Do you think unions have anything to do